I'd like to thank all three speakers, and I'd like to open the floor to hopefully some questions. And it's always funny type of starts.
It is always funny. I guess I have three issues that I want to raise. I mean, everybody talked about those cases where we couldn't really understand if there was intolerable suffering, or where there was something where it was appropriate or not to have physician-assisted death. But I think, or physician-assisted dying, whatever the terminology needs to be. But I think there are times whenever we know, like of those 100 cases where we may be asked or considered, there's probably 5 or 10 where kind of we know that those people are having a hard time. And is it not about whether we approach or we really want to deal even with those people? That's one. The second thing is I'm really fascinated that nobody actually talked about what does physician-assisted death actually mean. I mean, for me as a nephrologist, it means don't dialyze them and let them have Ramapril, chocolate and red wine, but I've got the easy way out. What does it mean for everybody else who doesn't have renal failure, end-stage renal disease around to help these individuals go forward with this? So nobody actually talked about that. And then the third thing around the sort of third thing is where in terms of when we are societally placing ourselves as who we want to revert to or what we want to be doing. You talked about the mechanisms about doing that. Where do we place our own personal, like we can have conscientious objections, but we also need to be aware of our own conscientious objections, and how do we become aware of that? So up until recently, whenever the law became that I could perform physician-associated death, or I was going to be allowed to very soon, I was very much in favor of it. Like, you and I had these conversations and I was on your side. And then I suddenly realized that would I actually push potassium into my patients? No. So how do we actually determine who we are and where we sit, and how do we manage that emotion as well? So as you're talking, like, those were three issues that just didn't come up in my mind.
I'll try to get all three of those as quickly as I can, and then I'm going to ask the other speakers as well to take them. I'll go with the third first. So, you know, the gradations of what is a conscientious objection, what is a professional objection, what is kind of an ick factor, which I would put those as sort of being the three different issues, right? So, you know, I will tell you that, you know, feel free to say no, and not because you feel that you have a moral objection to the act, but simply because you don't feel the person meets the criteria. So if somebody comes to you and is having a bad day, and you really don't think that they have grievous and irremediable suffering, and you think and you have reason to believe that in a way that you can actually write down logically. Well, I mean, how would that be any different, for example, than somebody coming to you demanding dialysis, right? Or if they came to you demanding to stop dialysis and you just thought they were having a bad day, would you simply grant their request without asking another question? Of course you wouldn't, right? Like, you would push them, you would prod them and say, listen, man, I mean, I hear what you're saying, I respect what you're saying, I'm not going to force you to do anything you want, but here's what I've noticed. You know, you often come in, you're having a bad day, but then you come in for weeks at a time, you're feeling great, and you keep coming here. So I feel like you are somebody who is suffering, you're having a bad day now, I want to help you with this, here's what I'm going to offer you, but I don't feel that for X, Y, and Z reason you meet the criteria set out in this law. Now, if you come back to me and you're having a persistent request that goes on for X amount of time, then I'll feel that you meet those criteria. But right now, I don't feel that you do. And I think that's a professional no, not a conscientious no. And I think that's important. Then the third part of being the ick factor, which is that I agree, I can assess you for criteria, and I can feel that you meet the criteria, but I myself will not do it. For me, this fits under the category of many of the other things that I believe in life, right? Like, I wouldn't marry another man, but I personally don't have any objection to men getting married, right? Or adopting children, or doing any number of other things. I personally would not ever perform an abortion, but I believe in a woman's right to choose. There is a strong and important difference between what I would do and would not do, and what I think should be allowed, what others should have a right to do, right? Like my right, the rights of society should not be defined by what I'm personally going to do or not do. And your last question about the dialysis, your second question about the dialysis versus an assisted death, I think is a really important one. I think for most cases, yeah, you're probably not gonna face this. You know, by the time somebody's actually sat up and done 2 requests separated by 50 days, you know, you saw the data that's most people live 7 days after they stop dialysis, so, you know, you wouldn't even make half of your waiting period, frankly, before you want to receive an assisted death. But at the same time, many people have fears about what their death will look like when they stop dialysis. Like, will they get a recrudescence of their nausea, of their neuropathy, of their encephalopathy? You know, you and I know that that's probably not what's going to happen. Most of the time when people stop dialysis, they kind of get drowsy and they doze off and they go to sleep. They don't often get the same things that the nasty uremic symptoms that they got before they started dialysis. And it's a little different. But many people, I think, out of fear of that, will be afraid, what we want what they call a clean death, right? They want to just go. They want to be great, and die.
But it's a difference between, I mean, I don't have to do this, but if I had ALS and you have to actually kill me,
yeah,
it's different from, you know, turning off my defibrillator and letting me die.
Right.
Right, so if you let me die because you've stopped my intervention, that's different from actively killing me, which is what I perceive physician-associated or assisted death as being.
Let me, again, as a flippant example, if it's a warm day and the pool is cold, do you go in one toe at a time or do you jump? I mean, some people, I guess the idea that you're sort of slowly easing into something, but not really sure how it's going to go versus, you know, I don't really want this thing to be dragged out. Let's just do this now, right? And I'm actually more worried about the process of dying than I am about death.
But it's what my role is in that.
Which is fair. But again, if they really felt strongly that they wanted an active rather than a passive death, would you feel comfortable withdrawing? And that's a question you got to ask.
I'll try to quickly answer the 3 questions in a slightly different order. Might not be the same order. I want to start by saying, though, James, very disappointed to hear that you would not marry another man because they're both my chances. But having said that, in terms of what element does the clinician or provider get involved in, I think that you're right. There are different roles. There is something that people will see differently between withdrawing care versus an active act. And in terms of the conscientious objection issue, what they have said, or what will likely happen, is that you can participate or not participate at any point. So you might well be participating up until the point where you're talking with someone about whether this is an option they want to pursue, explain to them all of the different implications of it, etc., but decline to be involved in the actual act. Exactly. And so I think that this touches a bit on what James was talking about, that who is going to do all of the actual different acts. And right now, you're right, it's very up in the air. It hasn't been fully decided yet, and it needs to be clarified. In terms of with the patient, what is the process that happens once they actually enter this and then continue through it? I think you answered most of what I would say. The one thing I would simply add is that I think it's very important that when somebody enters this, they not feel abandoned. Right? We see this in cancer care all the time. You see it in palliative care all the time. People think that, well, this means now that you are abandoning me. So what does it mean when we say to somebody that we now think their illness is irremediable? In fact, it's interesting because you cannot count, I can't keep track of how many times people who are involved in these policy debates, including the senators and stuff, instead of saying irremediable, they say irredeemable. Okay, so I would say make sure we don't abandon the patient. And then in terms of the first point you made, the issue of the cases that are very clear, that most people would say, yes, in this situation we can see the intolerability of suffering, we can see that they've tried things, there's nothing further that would lead to quality of life. That's going to go forward no matter what. I think what we're really trying to now hash out and figure out the best way of dealing with are the different shades of gray. Because there are a lot of shades of gray in here.
But I'm not sure that that's what the debate should really be about. I mean, I'm still, when I first came to Canada, it was, I don't even remember the guy's name, the guy who put his daughter into the car in the garage and poisoned her because she had this irremediable...
Robert Latimer.
Thank you, Latimer. And this was a man who did something, oh my God, this man was really strong. And oh my God, this man did something that we should have been doing to help him. And he got prosecuted and put away as a scapegoat for society to not do this. And so those are clear cases, in my mind anyway, There are times whenever patients clearly, I can see their suffering, I've lived through their suffering with them, I have emotionally found it difficult to help them through the processes, despite my links in palliative care. I find it difficult to provide the level of care that they need, and you know, so it's clear there. So why are we focusing on those patients where it's not clear? Let's focus on the ones that it is clear, and let's at least move our society forward. But then, you know, as somebody who is a strong advocate for palliative care within the renal world, I'm only willing to stop doing what I do. I'm not willing to do something I don't do. And I think that this is really where a lot of the controversy in my mind is, if I'm already extreme in my opinion, and yet I'm not willing to stop, or I'm not willing to do what I don't do, I'm willing only to stop what I do do, then do we not have a bit of a more controversy? And has nobody really touched on the points which are extreme? You know, you touched on softer points.
Actually, in the majority of cases, really, we don't have to do anything else. I mean, dying with uremia is, or kidney disease, as you said, is by and large not an uncomfortable death. And in the majority of the cases, we don't have to do anything else. The uremia itself, except for the example that Gavin mentioned, in the majority of cases, the patient will die in a few days. The difficulties that I have is when family members do not agree with that decision. The patient may be cognitively impaired or is suffering, but yet the grandson or the granddaughter somewhere, they don't agree with that decision. That really, I think, when sometimes we have difficulties.
I think that's also an important lead into the other issue that Bill C-14 is ducking, that the Select Committee advocated in favor of, and on which Carter is silent, is the idea of advanced consent for assisted dying. So the idea that somebody could write an advanced consent after being diagnosed with an illness, but before they become incapable. I think the scenario that everybody has in their mind is that of advanced dementia, and having seen a relative or a friend in that situation saying, oh gosh, I never want that to be me, and asking that be a right to them. I can tell you from having worked in the advocacy area around this, that is probably the #1 question on the minds of most Canadians, is actually not to have this available when they're dying. I say as important as having this available if they're dying of advanced cancer with serious physical suffering, is the idea of being in that situation. My concern is that, you know, I think we know how bad we are at imagining what our quality of life would be like in a situation of illness when we are not in that situation of illness, right? The amputation studies are very clear about that.
But I think one of the things that Stavros and Vanita bring up is the idea that we are kind of a little bit fooling ourselves in nephrology in that we have the out, right? Which is to stop doing stuff, and this is nothing new. This is something we've done for many decades, and the presentations today pointed out that this is one of the major causes of death on dialysis is people stopping what they were doing. But I think maybe the challenge for tonight's purposes is that not every case will fall in that, right? And even though we're relatively protected in nephrology because we can just stop doing stuff that we were actively doing, and that's easy, we're used to it. Well, I won't say it's easy, but at least we have precedent for it, we're used to it. But there are going to be cases that the patient will last longer, right? They'll have a few months worth of life left if we do nothing, but they don't want that. They want, and so I think we will be challenged on this, and so we can't sit back too far on our previous experiences. Although I agree with both Vanita and Stavros, and most of what we will be doing will be stopping, but there may be times where we're asked to play a more active role.
So I just want to tease that out. Is that, because you're bringing it up, is this a physician role? Is this going to be my role? Or is this, because the system has to do this? Is this the hospital that has to do this? I remember hearing something on the radio about some Quebec hospital saying, no, we're not getting into this business. We want it to be outsourced to a different area because we're in a different care setting. This is what we're planning to do. And we want it to be provided, but not by us. And I wonder whether someone's teased that out or someone's talked about that at all.
Sure, thanks. I'll actually, so I'll let James answer that. I don't think it's been fully teased out actually in any jurisdiction yet. Quebec is probably going a bit further ahead than others, but I think I'm going to broaden that beyond even that issue, because what you're touching on, it harkens back a little bit to what you were saying, James, that, and I will pick you up on the issue of cause of death that you started with. Cause of death not actually being withdrawal of dialysis, but other things. Philosophically, you could say that the only cause of death is life. If you broaden it enough, the only cause of death is life. And in that sense, it actually does touch a little bit on what you're saying in this debate, because there is potentially a difference between medical assistance in dying for illness versus the right to die for suffering. Not all suffering comes from illness. And how do we actually tease that apart? So for me in psychiatry, that's one of the primary considerations, because as I was saying in my presentation, it's something where not all of the illness or remediability is from medical symptoms, right? And it then touches on what you're saying. Is it a medical role? Is it a societal role if it broadens to right to die for suffering for various reasons? Conceivably, I could actually say, and in fact I did say this in one of the meetings, that with my myopia, this blurriness is intolerable to me. And I do not want refractive surgery, and these things pinch my, they actually do pinch my nose a bit, and these things pinch my nose, so I don't want them. And my suffering is intolerable. I have full capacity. People might argue that, but I probably and so I could go for that. Now, is that because of an illness or because of other suffering in life? Right? And then that leads to, is it a medical role or is it a societal role? I don't know.
I'm also myopic, both physically and metaphysically. I think the issue when it comes to institutional conscientious objection, I have a real issue. I have a real concern about that, because I think it is a misappropriation of the term. Conscientious objection, the idea that we as individuals can feel moral pain. And I know that if I was compelled to do something I found reprehensible, would feel moral pain. I should not be compelled to do that. I recognize that right exists in others, but they should not be forced to do that either. So I'll defend your rights, and to some degree the expectation you'll defend mine when the time comes. I don't see how that applies on a meso or macro level, right? Like the plural, like institutional conscientious objection is not the plural of individual conscientious objection. If everybody in an institution had the same conscience and the same values, you wouldn't need this, right? Nobody in your institution would do it. The concern, of course, becomes if somebody in your institution actually thinks this is okay and would do it. And then the institutional right of objection then gets invoked to constrain the actions of that individual, which is flat hypocrisy in my mind. You're asking for the right to opt out of the rules of society, but denying the right of an individual to opt out of your rules. I can't think of anything more hypocritical. But without getting into the actual, the actual rights of this institution, I think the simple fact is, on whatever basis you're going to base your decision to not offer a service in a facility, moral, professional, whatever, you don't feel it's safe, you need to guarantee access and have a well-oiled mechanism for getting this person somewhere reasonable where the service will be provided, or bring somebody in. The example I'll give you is last year, people were talking about this a lot in our National Palliative Care Meeting. They invited the CEO of a network of Catholic hospices from Oregon to come and give us a talk. So this is a guy himself is not Catholic, but ran a whole bucket of palliative care units around Oregon, all of which were strictly Catholic. And they operate on a private system there, so they're not a publicly funded institution. So they perfectly have the right to tell anybody to go to AG well. But when they got a request and they felt somebody met criteria, they would actually bring a volunteer in from Compassion and Choices Oregon, and that person would counsel them and work with them and say, look, if this person in the end did want to go through with this, they would arrange a transfer to another facility or take that person where they could get that. So this is what a Catholic facility who really has no constitutional obligation to offer anything was willing to do as a reasonable accommodation to their patients. For them, it became an opportunity to engage in a deeper discussion of the issues of suffering and the options available. And they felt this was them trying to represent and defend the rights of their patients. And I really would love to hold that up as a paragon example of what we really should be doing in this debate, rather than trying to build a higher wall or paint a thicker black line and tell people not to cross it.
I think your example is a really good one, because within our, for example, with our group at St. we had this topic come up after this group worked. Not a single one said that they would actually be actively involved in physician assisted dying. But the majority wouldn't object to someone else being involved. And so Jazz's question in some ways is like a pragmatic one. What do you do if you're agreeing to the idea that the service should be provided and no one wants to do it locally?
So I'm just going to follow up on that for a second.
In other words, just describe what's happening in Belgium and Netherlands. How do they set it up?
They have these. So I'll let you answer that in a second, but I just want to follow up on the previous point, which is that in terms of, it's not just a question of whose responsibility it is. This is part of the problem with the CPSO's interim ruling that you need to make sure there's an effective referral. Who's the effective referral? Right? I mean, one of the things that we had actually presented on was that you could set up something more akin to the review boards that we have in psychiatry, where it's not an individual or even an institutional responsibility, because in Toronto, most institutions will have people who will be willing to do this if they're large enough. But what about mid to small sized towns? That's simply not the case. So to some degree, unless you have something that crosses borders of localities, there are going to be access problems. And so something like a jurisdictional, again, you don't call it a review board, but you get the idea, which actually then has the responsibility to go around, could allow for there to be proper access.
I couldn't agree more, and I think to this point, there are about 100 ways to skin this cat, 100 ways to deal with this problem, and we are currently examining none of them.
Shannon?
Sorry, there's a couple of things. One is, Phil, I really appreciate the fact that you identified that there's nephrologists that probably wouldn't feel comfortable in doing this. And I think we can all look around the room and kind of understand, in terms of which nephrologist or physician might be more inclined to provide, let's say, something like painkillers versus not, and which to go to. It's the same thing in terms with providing support in terms of stopping treatment or wanting assistance in stopping life. And you look at the whole change structure in terms of the abortion movement and how that changed our societal views, and there became clinics and specialists that we would refer to because we felt uncomfortable. And it's kind of almost, you wonder if the movement will move in the same way. I kind of think that we need kind of a societal normative change where we're thinking about earlier rather than late. So then we're talking more about doing advanced care directives, and we're talking more about engaging the family. Because I think that some people can identify that if I were to ever become into this position, this is what I want my treatment to happen. And so it's kind of like an earlier discussion in terms of identifying how to deal with the certain elements and illnesses, and it becomes more of a normative society. The same way that we talk about, for instance, doing RSPs. It's a common language, whether we're talking about doing advanced care directives. It's not the same kind of way that we do things. And I think that if we were to start engaging in those kind of societal changes, it might have greater impacts.
I realize we didn't ask also about the approach of the Belgian system in the Netherlands is that they don't actually have a mechanism for referral, but they have something called a SCEN network, which is akin to what we described earlier. It's a network of loan providers that is accessible by multiple pathways. And they have private clinics that are well advertised. So there's not necessarily an obligation to seek this out. But again, when you live in a country where literally you can probably throw a ball from anywhere in another country, that's easier to do than in Canada, where people are so spread out.
So as a speaker, you took a sort of difficult and honest approach where you shared your own sort of thoughts on some of these controversial areas, like that you were supportive of women's choice, but you wouldn't want to actually do the abortion yourself. And I think that's appreciated in this kind of a context, because I think many of us would be wrestling with the same idea that there's a difference between the conceptual framework versus the actual nuts and bolts of getting it done. And I think that's what a lot of us are wrestling with coming up to this, in that many of us would be you mentioned objection and things like that. We may actually want that service to be available to the patient, but we either, for any one of a large number of reasons, wouldn't be able to get there ourselves.
But I think we need to be cautious with that statement, because, as a nephrologist, I have never seen or being trained to do an abortion. I mean, if you said to me cardiac cath, I want a lot of my patients to have a cardiac cath, but I'll be damned if I'm doing it, right? Or an endoscopy. It's years since I've done an endoscopy, and I probably would really want to do it without someone being around. So we've not been trained, so we have no right to make this statement, right? The 20-year-olds who are now currently in medical school who are doing it, maybe they're the ones who are going to be able to do this, and we let them evolve through, and they'll be taught how to give a shot of 40 kCl or whatever it is that you're supposed to be giving. So that's a different story.
But your examples are not completely, yeah.
Well, isn't that the easiest way to
for
die?
example,
second on
like if you wanted to learn how to do a cath, you could learn how to learn how to do a cath.
Right, but I think that's not, I mean, it's not the mechanics of it, it's the fact that I don't know, apart from knowing that James was going to be the one that I would speak to if I wanted to have this, I don't know anybody else who has actually said, well, okay, I know how to. Like, you and I have had this discussion before.
But within our group, for example, no one has stood up and said, I would do this, but I don't know how.
Okay.
I don't know how. Like the objections have been like, more like, if somebody else wants to do this, that's great, but
It's a comfort.
That's the next Harry.
Okay, so just also for the sake of discussion, I guess I started my disclosure. I don't think this is a very good idea. Just similar to you. So this is where I'm coming from. Instead of just arguing very this kind of way, I just wanted to point out a few things that you brought up and a few untouched areas. So one thing is that you cited several times that if you fit the criteria are set by whom, on what basis, on what grounds. So what are we talking about then, for one? Second, you alluded to the judges, the court, free meal decision. I think in treating hypertension, it would be quite difficult to justify this type of a decision making when you kind of base yourself on expert opinion and anecdotal evidence. And I'm not sure if society decided and how they decide, how would they decide if you ask them, who do you trust your life and death with? Is it lawyers? Is it physicians? So if lawyers make the criteria, if they set up the framework, why are physicians required to perform the task? Is it really necessary? What does it tell you? If several physicians who are in theory agreeable to this concept, which I'm not, but they say that, well, I wouldn't really do that. Is not that similar to Germany welcoming the few tens, few hundreds of immigrants, and then when they came by the millions, 65% of the people in Germany say that Merkel should go, and people are saying that Muslim or Islam has no place in Germany. So are we not going a bit too fast here? You cited that, well, your paper was 3 years ago, and it's 3 years. It's such a long time, and then, well, we should keep up. This reminds me of basically the way we do in medicine. So you don't read anything beyond 5 years. You set your filter in Medline, 5 years. Whereas if you go to psychoanalysis, do you read anything beyond 5 years, or do you read anything that was written in the last 5 years? Are we not going a bit too fast here? Are these questions that we are so clear that we need to get kind of solved, fixed, done? We need the technicalities instead of thinking really through what are the questions?
I don't know if I can answer all your questions, but to speak to the issue of subjectivity and criteria, I think that that's not without analogy in medicine. And the simplest question would be, when do you start dialysis? Would everybody answer that question the same way? I mean, I'm not asking for your answer. I'm just asking, do you think that every single nephrologist in this room would start dialysis at the same time as you? So there's clearly room for a spectrum of opinion on any question, which is why I'm encouraging people to say, look, you don't think somebody meets criteria, you don't have to invoke moral objection or whatever. You can say, look, I don't think you meet these criteria. The same way that if they came to you asking for dialysis, you could say no. And you could say, look, I'm willing to refer to another person for the opinion. And even if that person's an objector, you're not saying, look, I'm not asking you to do it. I'm just asking you to give a second opinion on whether this person meets these criteria or not. And I don't think that's outside the realm of what most people should be able to do. Now, in terms of broader questions about what we should or should not be doing, and is this too far and is this too soon, I don't think that's a medical question. I don't know if I'm fit to answer that question.
I don't think this is a medical question.
But I guess,
but you're not talking about a medical question. I think we are talking about existential issues, very deeply philosophical questions. So our medical rules do not apply here, especially the way we do medicine now. We're trying to do medicine.
The only point I would add is that I think in some situations the concepts are clearer and better defined in terms of when something might be irremediable or not. And although intolerable suffering is purely subjective, it's also true that there is a range of opinion about what people might agree is high or intolerable suffering versus what might not be. So the example of the blurriness of vision, I think most people would not agree that's intolerable suffering. What that does to me point out is that in some cases where there are broader shades of gray and lack of standards, like in the mental illness field, this is why that's my major area of interest with this, that if you don't have some degree of standards or definitions of things like irremediability and key definitions, then what happens? And then what happens is people end up actually not having something to follow that's based on science or based on accepted standards. There was a researcher from Michigan, Scott Kim, who testified at the Senate about 2 weeks ago, and what he was essentially saying was the same thing, that in the absence of definitions of things or standards in medicine, so in some areas we have better standards, in others we have less. And if you try to make decisions based on a lack or absence of standards, what happens? You basically base it on your personal opinion, right? So it becomes something that's based more on a belief system rather than a system of science or standardization. And that's, to me, what the concern is. At the same time, I would say that there are some areas where there are much clearer standards, right? And if you look at things like ALS or some of the other medical degenerative conditions that have been looked at here, who would say that, no, we think you're going to have some unusual, miraculous recovery, and that's what we should be looking for, right? So there are shades here. Andrew.
Half time? Are we okay for time?
We're okay as long as it's a short session.
Because the point is, sometimes come asking, well, you did not say anything provocative here. So, the dialysis patients are privileged in some way. If you think about it,
There's a problem.
why are they privileged? Because they decide they want to die. So they stop dialysis. We don't need a competence. We don't have to prove they're competent. We cannot do anything. Just stop dialysis. We have schizophrenic patients. Well, we bring them back on the form 1, the second day, they refuse dialysis, pull the lines, we accept it, they die. So they're privileged in that they don't have to pay to pass any criterion that the society may have wanted to impose on them. And the question is then, opposite to Istvan's position is, why should we have a privileged group and everybody else is non-privileged, and they don't have the right they deserve to in the society at large? In other words, they don't have access. The whole issue is access here. They don't want to commit suicide on their own, but they want access. And we tell them we have to be competent. Why should they be competent? Why can't someone who is not competent have the right to follow this process? So that's one controversial question. The second one is the legal one. All the successful outcomes of these controversial issues in Canada didn't come from laws. They came from bringing the laws down by the Supreme Court. And therefore, this is probably a better way to do that. The reason is the politicians won't assume the responsibility. The public will slowly adopt some form of solution, and slowly the rest of the society may follow or not. And this happened in the United States. Initially, Obama was against gays in the military. Or the Clinton had the whatever the expression is, So now it is legal to have gay marriage. A few years ago, they wouldn't even consider it. So therefore, the second solution is not to legislate it, let it be adopted by the willing. And the third question is, why do we feel so uncomfortable with that? And the reason is, when men were at the early stages of evolution, they were afraid they would be killed by somebody else. So they were afraid that their enemy would kill them. So slowly, after some time, they decided that for self-preservation, they have to be very careful, and eventually they have a pact with everybody else that they don't kill each other. So we became more civilized. So the reason we feel uncomfortable with the concept is we cannot agree with something that we can be exposed to the danger of being killed by somebody else in this society. We say, okay, what about I'm demanded in the future and I don't want to be killed, but somebody really, based on the legislation, kills me. So we feel uncomfortable. And later religion picked up all these elements and made them religious dogmas. If you kill somebody, you go to hell, whatever. So therefore, the science has evolved, but in reality, most of these times, the fear is that we don't want to be exposed to the danger. If, let's say, somebody gets murdered in Toronto, and then they say, oh, there was a gang heard off, we feel relief. Why? We're not part of a gang. It's pretty unlikely somebody will come and kill us. So therefore, you can see all of these things getting together, and you can look at the whole thing philosophically a little bit different. So why are we afraid of doing it? Second is, do we need a law? And third is, why are Diana's patients are so privileged? And again, I'm not supportive of the notion necessarily, but these are the thoughts that come to my mind.
I just love that, I'm sorry, you're a psychiatrist, sir? As you say, I'm like, you guys are killing me with your 3-part questions now. Like, I'm really struggling to remember the questions. Like in the ICU world, these questions like 3 words long. We're just fast that way.
Do we ventilate?
Yeah, DNR, CPR. We're so I guess to your first question about capacity, and I'm not sure if I'm entirely going to answer it, but I think it picks up on a point that Sanu made, which is that we bring so much of our own sort of visions about subjectivity, what is right, when we belong into this. And I often throw out the question to everybody. I say, look, when was the last time you formally assessed capacity in a patient who was agreeing with you? Right? Like the number one, we all know what we're supposed to do, and we all know how we're supposed to assess our capacity, but in reality, the number one question is, we don't even bother assessing capacity unless the person rejects our advice. And then we're like, what? Why are you rejecting our advice? We better investigate. He's got some sort of capacity issue. And then you could have the most floridly delirious person, but as long as they agree with the OGD that you're proposing, you're like, oh yeah, just sign here. And then it just speaks to it, is that we naturally judge people differently based on whether or not they are, we assign actual character traits to people who agree with us and different ones to those who disagree with us. I don't think we're ever going to get away from that, right? Because we do that in every aspect of medicine, and this will be no different whatsoever. And the other difficult questions I want to ask.
I was really hoping you'd answer all 3 because I don't remember the other 2. But I'm going to sort of segue into something which I think kind of answers it, but maybe not quite. That's okay, is it? Does anybody remember the name of the movie? I'm blanking on this. I've been trying to think of this as you were speaking in response to the question with Brian Wilson. The Brian Wilson movie that was out recently. Remember the singer from Beach Boys?
Yeah.
What was the title of the movie? Okay, so as you're looking that up, actually perfect. So if you can look that up and then because I can't remember the title, but I'll tell you why I'm saying this. Because for me, some of what you're saying, I think there are a couple of different debates going on. And we tend to conflate a lot of things together. One is when somebody actually has made a decision.
Love and mercy.
Thank you. Love and mercy. Love and mercy.
Has made a decision.
Has made a decision that they are in a state of intolerable suffering and wish to die, and that's going to continue. And then that's what generates a lot of debate, and people have a lot of different views and feelings about that. And I think that's largely where the debate and discussion has been. What honestly, what I've been trying to talk about in terms of the mental illness issues is a bit different. Because we know that in those situations, people's assessments of the situation and their actual circumstances often change over time. And we don't know when to say they're not going to. And that's the point. It's not. So the whole piece that I was talking about with mental illness is not to suggest that, oh, should we be keeping people in a state of intolerable suffering when they wish to die? Right? That touches on some of the moral points that you were actually talking about in ethical points. But it's a question of, well, what if we're seeing somebody in a situation here, which, as the Supreme Court says, we need to protect people in particularly vulnerable circumstances. We need to protect them particularly vulnerable from induced to commit suicide. So what if at that point in time they are being induced to commit suicide by their illness? And they will go on to have a fulfilling life later. And this loops back to that movie for me, because the irony for me was, I had just given a talk on PAD at the Canadian Academy of Psychiatry and the Law in Vancouver. I'm flying back on the plane and I'm watching this movie, Love and Mercy. And I didn't know the story, and I won't give any spoilers. But in a nutshell, the lead singer of Beach Boys in this movie and in his life ends up being diagnosed for part of his life as being paranoid schizophrenic. And it goes through what he went through for a period of years and then gets to some other point later. And I'm watching this, and it was very emotional for me because I actually realized, oh, this is the kind of guy who, if things aren't implemented properly, would have ended his life at one point in here. And yet he got to somewhere very different. And so I would just end on saying, I think sometimes we need a bit more love in person.
It's hard to imagine, because how many years of some suffering, but it turns out a good happy ending at the end, does that make up for those?
Well, sometimes it's months, sometimes it's. So who makes that judgment?
That's our question.
In the past, there was an article where 30 patients, dialysis patients, decided to stop dialysis. And eventually, they changed their minds in the state of dialysis. And then they were asked, what do you think about your original decision? And they said, well, it was a wrong decision. So at the same time, a lot of other patients who stop dialysis and they die, they don't have the chance to change their mind, they're dead. So you can argue, therefore, this applies to so many cases. I mean, some of them black and white, and a lot of them are very gray.
Yeah. I don't know that there's an obvious answer to that. I mean, the problem again with the human condition is that we are indecisive. We do change our mind, and reasonable people can come to opposite decisions without the same question. Does this law, does this right change any of that? Obviously not. And I also would say I think we have to be careful not to catastrophize as well, right? Because to some degree this is going to be an issue that will come up very rarely in psychiatry. I think will come up very rarely in nephrology. I think it speaks to the issue of the importance of having sessions like this to discuss this, to develop some practice norms. Your challenge, both as a nephrology community and as a psychiatric community, if I ever figure out which of those you are, would be to at least come up with something consistent, some rules that you can follow. And understand that those will change with time, because that's the nature of how we make decisions.
Very interesting discussion. The love and mercy question. In one of the early lessons of psychiatric training, amongst the many tools that we are given, one of them that I learned is that at the very least we could be a bridge to hope. And that bridge presupposes that there is something always better, or that the treatment plan can work, or that we can modify the treatment plan to get to a better place. So that investment in the patient and in the potential for that patient was always something that I think was part of the therapeutic engagement at work. When we think about it in those terms, I think we could end up doing the right thing more often than not. But there's another side to this, and it's the side of scientific innovation. And do we, as physicians, when we have a patient before us and we're looking at these set of criteria, do we take into account that there may be the prospect of something better from a scientific innovation point of view? In other words, it's not static. And we're not pretending that somebody who is suffering terribly is going to have an immediate or magical, cure around the corner, but that there may be solutions within scope that may change the whole paradigm. And a few examples may come to mind. A decade ago, did we imagine, that there would be advancements in autoimmune disorders the way we have them today, and the biologics? Did we imagine the advancements in diabetes or in oncology or immuno-oncology? How do we create that bridge then for our patients, or in front of us thinking about a suicidal or a end-of-life solution? What responsibility do we have to translate the prospect of that innovation to maybe change their thinking or to change our thinking about what is before us? This is a dynamic process here on many, many levels, and this is one level that maybe we should have a greater responsibility of both enriching our knowledge about and translating it to our patients to change it.
So I'll answer that a little bit from either side of the diet. That if you look at the patient side, what I would say is that part of it is that under whatever framework unfolds, I think it would be challenging to say that we should or would be able to impose our wish for hope on the patient, that they should wish or hope for the next thing, even if they don't see it right now, and they're not wanting to wait for it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one part of it. I think that in terms of some of this, it needs to be the patient's decision. But the flip side, and it's interesting this didn't really come up too much, is what's the impact on us as clinicians and the people involved? Not just what role are we willing to participate in, but what is the impact on us if we participate, but also in our different roles. And as a psychotherapist, what I would say is that maybe those are different roles, because absolutely part of the value of psychotherapy often is an element of instilling hope for change, hope for some improvement. If you are then also the same person who is designated to say, no, now we think this is, or I as your therapist think this is irremediable, what does that do to the therapeutic alliance? So maybe that shouldn't be your particular role in that therapeutic relationship, because you can't continue to do some assessment of the person's irremediability and also maintain the therapeutic alliance. I don't know. But again, this is part of what we have to work through for the complex things that we talk about. Great.
So, is this working?
Microphone.
So let me muddy the waters a bit more for you, because you've made some good comments and the questions have come up. But let me comment on the issue of the meta-psychology of life and death. What is it? As you know, at the turn of the century, Sigmund Freud discovered the basic instincts. He spoke about the mind as being divided in the conscious layer and the unconscious layer. And he defined two basic instincts: life, which he called eros, and death, which he called thanatos. He said that for us to exist in a balanced way, intrapsychically, that the struggle between both instincts have to reach a homeostasis. They have to be in balance. Whereas when one side pulls the other side over too much, the death instinct takes over and suicidal ideas become conscious. So, as I gave you the example in the third case of the young man, he in fact did not want to die. He wanted to punish his family. He wanted to punish his brother for having the health and the happy marriage and everything, the prosperity which he did not have. Freud also spoke to us, taught us the condition of sadomasochism. So this young man was being sadistic to his family, and at the same time he was being masochistic to himself. He wanted to punish them. And this was unconscious. He didn't understand that. He rationalized his unconscious thoughts as, I've been sick for a long time, I've got diabetes, I'm tired of injecting myself with insulin, I'm tired of going to dialysis. Those were the conscious rationalizations that he had reached, but unconsciously, he wanted to punish his family. The same dynamics did not exist in the 80-year-old ladies. They had suffered enough, but they decided, look, I don't have anybody left in my family. I don't have no meaningful relationships. I don't have anybody to love or be loved by. They made a conscious decision, which was free of the struggle between the life and the death instinct, more or less. What's obvious in today's discussion is that we, as physicians, as healthcare workers, we're hardwired to live and to make someone else live who needs our help. It's a hardwiring in us. It's part of our Hippocratic oath. So this is consciously very clear, and in a lot of us it's unconsciously very clear as well. We're not struggling with these issues as physicians. When we interact with other patients, with a patient who wants to die, and we feel that there's no need for you to die, you can live another 2 years, continue with dialysis or chemotherapy or whatnot. What are we reacting to when we say this? Well, we're reacting to a condition which is known as countertransference. The patient is transferring their feelings onto us, their expectations onto us, and we're reacting in our own unconscious to our experience and the feelings that the patient brings up in us, which may be contrary to how they're feeling. So if I say, yes, I consent to my 85-year-old patient wanting to withdraw treatment, am I thinking, well, you know, she's lived 85 years, maybe I won't even live that long, so let her go? Am I thinking that? Or am I saying, here are all the scientific explanations, rational reasons, here's the law, she's competent to make the decision, so let her go. You know, I put this question to you. What are you feeling inside? What conflicts are you struggling with as physicians, as healthcare providers, before you make a decision to enable the patient to end their life? It's very complex. It's complex, it's unconscious, and there's a whole metapsychology around that we haven't talked about. I'd like to make you more aware of that.
We'd like to come back to the definition. So we're talking about suffering as one of the key concepts here. It is irremediable, and so the only way to go ahead is to end life. So when I round in dialysis, not now, but when I did round, one of the frequent issues that came up that, how are you? Oh, I feel terrible, I can't sleep. Or I have pain, my back is killing me, this is not life. So what do? What do we do most of the time? We take our prescription pad and give something, or maybe we write an order for a test and then give something, a pain medication or sleeping pill. Not quite an expert in that, but I think that in many of these cases, these complaints, these symptoms, these sufferings, this is a sign of suffering, are complex psychosocial constructs. And we are medicalizing them, and we are dealing with them within our strictly biomedical framework, and with this physician attitude of doing something. So, as an analogy, there is a patient with advanced cancer, not talking about nephrology where you can stop dialysis, advanced cancer, when they say, well, I'm suffering, I want to end life. Instead of, is this the only way that you can alleviate that suffering? Have we killed that patient? Did we try anything else? In a complex psychosocial, whatever construct it is. in these cases, quite frequently, hopelessness emails. Did we deal with that? Can we make that final step before trying to exhaust all the other options? Did we put another social worker, a psychologist in that unit? Why is it that 80, 70, 60% of the patients who are in a similar stage of cancer are not regressing and dying? What is the difference? What is that gives them hope? Not hope in getting better, not hope in not dying, not hope in not dying in a terrible way, but even that road that leads there, it might be different. There is this story, I don't remember that book, where there was this old piano teacher who had cancer, and instead of ending their life, they went to hospice, and this guy who wrote the book, I believe, decided that they will bring children there to have piano lessons with this teacher. They had a few months of life. At the end of that life, they had a piano concert in the home of this teacher. And that was the end of it. And not going there, I'm suffering a lot. Here is Ativan at 1 milligram QHS for receipt.
Yeah, assisted dying is not the solution to chronic underfunding or misappropriation of resources in the healthcare system. I think that my only answer to that is not, that assisted death is the solution to these problems, but just making sure that we apply the same questions and the same criticisms to every other decision that we have around medical care. And I'll use the dialysis question, is that all of these are very legitimate questions. All of the things that you will ask somebody who requests assisted death, and say, well, no, things might get better, you have to think more about it. Ask yourself, and it's a rhetorical question, ask yourself if, somebody coming in with suffering, an older person maybe or a younger person, with chronic suffering, really bad suffering and poor quality of life, considering starting dialysis, would you ask exactly those questions of them? And if they chose not to start dialysis, would you feel as indignant about that and ask as many questions about that scenario?
I don't have any other comments on that. I think that they're all valid points that you've got to think about in this whole discussion, because it can't just simply be about, well, there is suffering, let us help you end it immediately. And suffering is multifaceted. It comes in many different ways, and as we talked about earlier, I don't think any of us have entered medicine without the wish to alleviate something. Right? So if the suffering is coming from other things that haven't been looked at, I think we have an obligation to try to help alleviate that suffering. I still don't think that it necessarily removes the challenge that you might have with someone who comes back and says to you, but okay, we've tried all these things, and I'm still suffering. I still have these terrible physical symptoms. So then what do you do? Right? So there are different sides of the same coin in a way, but they lead to different places. One is, yes, absolutely, should not be a reflex that all suffering is something that we say, okay, we're going to turn the switch on. But you might have some people who legitimately say, okay, I don't know what else can be tried.
I think at this point we should stop. To me, I think the wonderful idea is that it's different from treating hypertension. And I think to me the profound difference is that this topic touches our very own subjectivity and humanity, and it begins a conversation within ourselves, and therefore it invokes all kinds of responses and reactions, and it covers the whole gamut of human reaction. And I think sometimes it's difficult to get in touch with ourselves, and some of us would rather just deal with potassium and the blood pressure. But how wonderful it is to discover ourselves. So I'd like to thank both speakers for a very profound, engaging discussion, and for the wonderful music that we all made together.